الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأنصاره وأزواجه وذرياته أجمعين سلم تسليما كثيرا وسلم عليكم بتحية الجنة الفردوس السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. I kind of feel like Barry White right now with this microphone. I'm not sure why my voice suddenly became so extremely deep. So I apologize. I hope that the audio, inshallah, on this will be okay. So the topic that we began last night was the idea of cultural relevancy. There was one particular term that was used that was called urf. It's an Arabic word that's translated as custom. And this is a word that is actually used in the technical studies in Islam, so in fiqh, in usul, in studies of sharia. Urf is a technical term. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. One of the books that I'm using a brief excerpt from is by a scholar who is actually from Ashanqit, so he's from Mauritania, and as anybody knows, actually the people of Ashanqit are a really special breed of people. They're, for one, their memory seems to have an almost unlimited capacity. They're really quite a special group of people. So he's a Shanqiti scholar that actually wrote a book that was dealing with mu'amalat. So the book itself is dealing with essentially economic transactions, but the introduction of his book is actually a really great primer on the sort of usul, or the sort of methodology of jurisprudence. And I'm going to try to get away from this overly cumbersome technical terminology as we go, but I'm just kind of putting it out there so that, one, people don't think that this is, Marc Manley's 101 Great Ways of Shake and Bake Islam or something like this. So I will try to move away from the overly burdened technical stuff, but just so you understand that this is rooted in Islamic science and Islamic studies. So his book, again, is the entire book deals essentially with mu'amalat, but Dr. Quta, his book, his primer, the muqaddimah, the introduction, is a great piece on the usul of it. And that's what I'm going to give as a point of departure to talk about. So I'm going to try to get some of the heavy lifting out of the way first, to explain some of the methodology, and to, again, try to root what I'm talking about in the tradition, because, for one, I think that when we have tried in the very recent, the recent past to begin this conversation of talking about, Islam in America, and talking about cultural relevancy, sometimes that is interpreted as, well, we're just trying to find some carte blanche way of assimilating and getting away from any kind of responsibility of acting in accordance of a way that would be recognizably Muslim. And I want to kind of try to assuage those concerns that people may have, that, this is, again, just some sort of shake and bake thing, but this is, what we're actually attempting to do here. And because, again, Islam has not been in America very long. I mean, last night, one of the things we talked about is that while there is, solid scholarship that shows that Muslims had indeed come to the Americas, before Columbus, with Columbus, after Columbus with the slaves, right? There's no contesting the truth of that. But an additional truth to those facts is that the Islam that we have today in America is not a result of an unbroken chain of narrative of those Muslims that happened to come at those sort of pre-modern times up until now. And that what we have is something wholly new and wholly different. And that I had explained last night that, you know, what's very interesting is that Islam, in a recognizable way, didn't really show up on the landscape in America until about the 1960s. And I say that, some people will say, well, what about this or that? And again, I accept that there were Muslims. I'm not saying that, you know, Muslims just popped out of the air in 1964. However, because of the Immigration Act that opened up large-scale immigration of Muslims from the historic Muslim world to America, and then the move from Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, Wallace Muhammad, leaving the Nation of Islam and becoming a bona fide Muslim, becoming an Orthodox or quote-unquote Sunni Muslim, those two things happened very much around the same time. And part of my reason of wanting to draw our attention to that is that sometimes I feel that Muslims in America have this feeling of like, well, we all wound up here through some like cosmic mishap, you know, and that they don't see providence in them being here. And, you know, you hear a lot of this talk about, well, you know, Muslims came here for dunya. Well, I mean, why do you do anything? I mean, we're all here for some aspect of dunya. That's why in the khutbah yesterday, where, you know, I had quoted the verse from Surah Al-Qasas where Allah says, وَلَن تَنْسَى نَصِيبُكَ, you know, مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. Don't forget your portion of this world. You know, and seek, you know, وَابْتَغِي فِي مَا آتَكَ اللَّهُ, you know, دَارُ الْآخِرَةِ, and seek the abode of the hereafter. Seek the afterlife through whatever means that Allah has given you. So I'm trying to get us to have a sense of purpose and providence in our being here in America to help overcome a kind of stigma that we have. Like, we're here, but we're really not here for the right reasons, and that, oh, we just came here for dunya. Well, that's a very, to be blunt, that's a very sort of atheistic way of looking at why we're here. We need to look at the world through a theistic lens. We need to see that, you know, it's kind of like وَيَكِيدُونَ كَيْدًا وَأَكِيدُ كَيْدًا, and that they have a plan, but right? Allah says they had a plan, but I have a plan. Maybe we did come here. I mean, obviously, I was born here. Maybe some of us did come here for dunyaistic reasons, for worldly reasons. And as I had said yesterday, that's not a blameworthy action necessary. So one, we need to remove these kinds of stigmas so that we can get down to the business of being serious about America. Because as I said, 90% of us or more, 95% of us, 99% of us aren't going anywhere else, right? For those of us that converted or reverted, or, you know, as I choose, I prefer those who chose Islam, right? Those who chose to be Muslim, and those who have come from the historic Muslim world. 99% of us aren't going anywhere, right? I mean, if you came from Egypt to America, given the way that Egypt currently looks, you ain't going anywhere, right? If you came here from Pakistan, the way Pakistan looks, you ain't going nowhere. And therefore, if this is where we're going to be, and this is where our children are going to be, I mean, if this is where you're going to be buried, this is where your children are going to be buried, and this is where your grandchildren are going to be buried, then we need to destigmatize being in America as Muslims. This is absolutely critical to having and developing a healthy Muslim psychology in America. And I think that's one of the things that are kind of inhibiting us at this moment of getting over ourselves and ultimately seeing that the reason why we are here is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that God Almighty, didn't want us to be anywhere else. And in fact, if we needed to be somewhere else to be valid Muslims, to be authentic Muslims, then He would have put us there. So that's that's maybe part of like a great overarching theme of what I'm trying to talk about is get us down and get us serious to the business of being, in America. So to start, I'm going to go into just a little bit of the technical things here that Dr. Khuta talks about. And I think it's important because even though some of it might be a little heavy, a little wordy, it's actually, some of it's actually quite enlightening, and it's certainly worthy of some investigation. And he gives us some really good food for thought in terms of, again, trying to dispel this American exceptionalism when it comes to Islam, that as if what we're trying to do here in America as Muslims in terms of talking about being culturally relevant, trying to develop an authentic and lived-in Muslim culture, as if that's something different than what every other Muslim community has done throughout history. It's just that, one, we tend to be very far removed from that now, and that many of those cultures have been lived in for such a long time that it just gives the feeling, it gives off this feeling that it's been that way always, but in fact it hasn't been that way always. And that on the world stage, as a whole, Islam is a pretty new religion. I mean, we've been here for just a little over 1,400 years. So when you look around the world, I mean, some Muslim countries, like the subcontinent or like Egypt, North Africa, I mean, they've really only been Muslim for like 1,000 years. So when you compare that to the world stage of, the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire or the Persian Empire, really haven't been around, for that long. So anyway, he lists some really interesting he lists some really interesting details here that we should really consider, and I'm going to list a few of them here, and I want us to think about these in the context of how can we get about to legitimizing ourselves here in America, because I think that's one important part. So he starts off in one of the mabhath, and he says that it is the ahmiyat al-urfi wa hajiz al-faqih ila i'tibarihi. So he starts off by saying that one of the important points to consider when talking about urf or talking about customs or talking about culture is that, one, there is the need وَحَاجَةُ الْفَقِيهِ إِلَى اعْتِبَارِهِ, so that there is, one, a necessity of the faqih, right? So the faqih is a technical term, like the mufti, the person who's a jurist, who's going to be writing laws or making rules or going to be interpreting situations to come up with decisions of, to either do A or to not do A, or to do B versus A, or to not do anything, right? Part of this decision-making process is going to have to take local customs and culture into account. So that's why he starts off by saying, أهمية العرف وحاجة الفقيه إلى اعتباره. So amongst these, he gives some bullet points. And he says, حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف في فهم نصوص الشرعية نفسها. So the first part of one of the major bullet points that he lists here is the necessity for the faqih, or the necessity for the judge or the person who's going to be writing laws as it relates to culture, إلى العرف في فهم النصوص, as it relates to, first off, and this is why I want people to understand this isn't some kind of shake and bake thing. The first point he's saying is that one of the major necessities to even get into this business of talking about culture and interpreting culture is that, one, the faqih has to have a understanding of the canon of Islamic law. So he says, إلى العرف في فهم نصوص الشرعية نفسها. So one, we're not talking about trying to accommodate American culture or create a Muslim culture or any of this negotiation that's going on. We're not doing this or talking about, or at least I'm not suggesting that we're going to do this off the cuff or off the tops of our head. This, first off, has to be rooted in the canon of the Islamic legal tradition. sounds kind of heavy, right? But this is what I'm talking about. And this is one of the things that Dr. Qatar lays out, is that one, any consideration of custom, whether either to condemn or condone, has to be rooted through essentially the lens of the Islamic legal tradition. The second bullet point that he gets to is حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف حال تعامله مع مدوناته والكتب الفقهية. So the other aspect or the other obligation that is upon the faqih or the jurist or the judge as it relates to urf is, he says, is حال تعامله مع المدونات, that he has to understand the conditions that relate to, contracts and essentially the canon of books. وَالْكُتُبُ الْفِقْهِيَّةِ. So you also have to not only understand kind of like Sharia on a theoretical level, you need to be conversant with actually rulings that have gone on in the past that are in the books of law. So maybe as you're going to consider a custom for this or a custom for that, or thinking about doing something, you need to also be familiar, like on a sort of on a colleague level, right? And this is not for the rank and file Muslim. I mean, this will be a major task for the Muslim leaders here in America and the scholars and whatnot, to also then be familiar with what other people have done in other times and other places. So you have to be familiar with what he calls the مع المدونات والكتب الفقهية. And then the third that he gives, and this is also very important. Matter of fact, the third and the fourth points will be the major part that we will talk about, because these, I think, have the most meat on the bone for us. So the third point, he says, حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف لفهم الواقع. So the third obligation is for the jurist or the faqih, is as it relates to the accommodation of custom, is that he has to have لفهم الواقع. You have to understand the situation at hand. This is why, and some people don't like it when you say, oh, well, it's really not appropriate for a scholar that's living 3,000 or 5,000 miles away to make, to make statements or authoritative decisions for those who are living thousands and thousands of miles away from him in another reality. And there has been some pushback against that, and people say, well, al-harrumat al-harrumat, right? That which is haram in every place, and that which is halal in every place. And while that is true, while that is true in a sense, what they're missing is actually the other at least 3 or 4 degradations that are between haram and halal. So it's true. Pork is haram in France, and pork is haram in Argentina, and pork is haram on the moon. Nobody makes any contestation of that. And apples are permissible to eat whether you're on the rings of Saturn or whether you're on the bottom of the ocean. Nobody makes any contestation of that. What we want to talk about is not only the harramat and that which is permissible, that which is not and which is permissible, but the degradations, as we talked about yesterday during lunch, that there are other groups of mu'akkada, mubah and makruh. Like there are things that are maybe praiseworthy, neutral, disliked. So we also want to essentially get nuance. We want to have some nuance to this discussion, because the world is not black and white, right? I mean, look around us. We're surrounded by color. We're surrounded by nuance. And this is a deen of nuance. And I say this not to try to get away from that which is impermissible. And we will talk about some of those scenarios in which maybe there won't be room to wiggle. And then we'll obviously talk about scenarios in which we should try to maximize that because of what we're trying to accomplish. So it's not, I'm not a person just, I'm not a liberal. And I don't say that as a pejorative, just so that people understand. I come from probably slightly right of center just by my personality. I'm not a hyper-conservative person, but probably if you were to put me in some sort of camp by modern understanding, I would probably be like a notch to the right of center versus anything to the left. However, because I may be slightly more inclined to a conservative point of view, that doesn't mean that I am committed to conservatism, right? There's a difference between conservative opinions because I want to be in the act of conservation, right, versus just committed to it, come hell or high water. That's not what I'm talking about. So he talks about, one, you have to know the conditions on the ground. You have to know the situation. وَتَحْقِيقِ الْمَنَاطِ. And that you have to know what is the goal. Like, what's the focus of even considering custom or culture? What is the custom? وَتَنْزِيلُ الْأَحْكَامِ عَلَى الْحَوَادِثِ. And then he says that essentially you're getting into something that's almost called deduction, that in terms of the setting down of laws, based upon scenarios. So if you're going to try to create, and this is what we're also trying to, or one of the points that I want to hammer home, when we're talking about consideration or accommodation of culture, while we are trying to maybe start a movement to get people mentally, complacent towards this, we're not talking about something that's just carte blanche, where you just accept anything whatsoever. That it essentially will be a case-by-case scenario. But what we want to do is create the mechanism by which we can handle cases as they come. So this is kind of creating a system by which we will do case-by-case analysis of this or that custom, whether we can say yay or whether we can say nay. So his last part about tanzil al-ahkami ala al-hawadith, that this will be based upon scenarios. And again, I apologize. I know some of this is really heady, so I want to get some of the heavy lifting out of the way first, and then I will try to move on to the things that will be a little bit lighter, a little bit more fun, and that will be more malleable in your minds and in your hands. The fourth point that he says, and this really drives home a major point, is that he says, حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف لمعرفة الناس. That another major point of obligation for the faqih, for the jurist or the person that's going to be trying to engage in the accommodation of custom, is لمعرفة الناس. He has to know the people. Which again, this is my personal objection, and also the objection of many other scholars in America, of foreign-born scholars outside of America, foreign-born scholars in America that are committed to the American, project of Muslims. I don't have any problem. This is not some type of, country club. But we're talking about people outside of America that are not committed to America and are not in that reality and are not intimately familiar. Because the word that Dr. Qatar here uses is li ma'arifatin nas. You have to know the people, which means you have to know their history, you have to know their customs. I mean, you have to know intimate detail. And obviously last night in our discussion, it became very apparent that many Muslims don't know American history. And this is actually something I highly recommend for the lay Muslim, right? Learn American history. Because as Brother Rashid and I were talking on the way over here, get over the fact that this is your home, right? You cannot continue to walk around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years with your luggage, right? At some time, you got to go to baggage claim, pick up your bags, catch a cab, go home, unpack, and make a new life. And the fact that if you've opened a business here, if you've gone to school here, if you're a working professional here and you're not going back, then what are you doing walking around like a tourist? And one of the quotes from the movie that I love that I'm going to try to use as a framework for this is Inception. And the character Eames in the movie, played by Tom Hardy, is a really great character. He says, there's no room for tourists on this job. And there's no room for tourists on this thing called Islam in America. If you are a tourist here, ahlan sahlan ahlan bikum. Come and visit, right? Go to Disneyland, do the American Hajj, right? Go to Disneyland, do whatever that you do. But if you are a tourist, don't get into the business of handing out street corner fatwa. If you're not here, and you're not going to stay here, and you're not committed to here, ahlan bikum. You're welcome to come and be amongst us, but don't get into the business of telling us what we do because you don't know the people, you don't know the situation on the ground, and that you will not be here to be able to analyze case-by-case scenarios. And more importantly, the typical person is not intimately familiar with the with the canon of laws, with things that have been judgments that have been handed down previously, and are not intimately familiar with all of the different ahkam of the Sharia. So we want to actually raise the discourse to a point that most of us get out of the business of being muftis and get into the business of being mu'mins. As we were saying coming over, and even I apply this to myself, most of us need to be quiet. We need to shut our mouths and open our hearts and our pocketbooks. Just to be frank, that will bring about tremendous more benefit, and I apply this to myself, so I'm going to try to hurry up and say this and then shut up, is we need to, we need to really kind of try to dampen a lot of the, chatter. I mean, obviously getting together and sharing ideas, I'm not talking about dispelling that. I'm talking about the authority of crisis that we have in our community here in America. And leave the business of authority, up to good authorities. That's why we live in a society that we call, rule of law. That we've obviously seen the tragic consequences of ordinary citizens trying to take the law into their own hands. In the case of, Jordan Davis and Trayvon Martin. I mean, we see what happens when you try to take the law into your own hands. I mean, if something is truthfully threatening your life, that's a different story. But because you just don't like the way that, somebody's blasting their music in their car, or you think somebody doesn't quite belong in your neighborhood, to take the law into your own hands, right, you need to leave that to the appropriate authorities. That's why we live in a society that you call 911 when something happens. So in the same way, Islam is also a deen of rule of law, where we try to leave those things to experts. So those are the main points that there's that you need to have. Anybody engaging in this is going to need to have intimate familiarity with essentially the Islamic science, legal tradition, judgments that's been handed down in the different books of law and fiqh and the canon. They need to know the situation on the ground. They need to have some goal or focus in mind of what the purpose is going to be. And they need to be able to need to be able to handle these things in a case-by-case scenario, and then perhaps even above all, they need to have intimate familiarity with the people that they're dealing with. So these are the major points that Dr. Qatar talks about. So he goes on, and I'm going to skip over a lot of these things because they're so they're so dense. If anybody wants, I will put maybe a few quick notes up on my website, marcmanley.com, with a link to the PDF. It's all in Arabic, but for anybody that wants to do some really mind-bending reading in Arabic language about this, then by all means, I will inshallah try to make that available. Sure. The name of this book is called Athar al-Urfi. So, the consideration of Urfi وتطبيقات المعاملات في الفقه المعاملات الصالحة. So it's the consideration of customs and sort of like cultures in in Islamic economic transactions. في الفقه المعاملات المالية. So, and the author, his name is Dr. Adil bin Abdul Qadir Qawta, and I believe that he's from Jamiat al-Malik Abdul Aziz. So he's been a professor at the University of Malik Abdul Aziz in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah. But I believe is originally from Shanqit. And again, most of the book is actually, one, pretty dry, and two, in terms of it comes to the fiqh of mu'amalat or transactions, is like, I'm not a scholar of Islamic finance, so most people will find the bulk of the book like, wow, man, I can't really, So, unless that's really your thing. But again, if you can read Arabic and you understand it, then again, his introduction to the book of what I'm talking about, if you're able to do so, I do recommend it. It's a very fascinating read, and that's you will probably find it, inshallah, fairly engaging. So those are just the major bullet points that I want to lay out from the book as we begin to talk about that. He goes into some other points, but I think really, just for the sake of brevity, I think I'm going to leave those out. I think those 4 major points are enough to essentially kind of get the juices flowing, and that we'll move into the other part. Assalamu alaikum. Any questions before we move on? I know that was, I'll just try to take a pause. Yeah. Oh, sure. So the 4, you want me to repeat them in English or in Arabic? Okay. So the first part of what he's talking about, I'll make sure I try to give the most accurate translation. Go back to my page here. I should have this memorized by now. I taught this book, actually, the same intro a couple years ago in Boston in a summer class. So the first part, he says, is the necessity for the faqih, or the judge, as it relates to custom, is to, one, have a comprehension. He says, في فهم نصوص الشرعية نفسها, to have a comprehension of the texts of Islamic law in and of themselves. The first obligation upon the faqih, as it relates to custom and culture, is to have a comprehension of the texts of Sharia in and of themselves. I'm scared. It's like one of the few lectures people ever take notes. The second point is that the necessity, as it relates to the faqih, or the judge, in relation to culture, is, he says, حال تعامله مع مدونات والكتب الفقهية, is to know the situation, or to know the occurrence of the nature of transactions. Because again, and this part really deals more with the parts later in the book, because this is a book on Islamic finance and transactions. But the second part of it is very important, which is al-mudawanati wal-kutub al-fiqhiyya. So it's like essentially an addendum to the first point, which is that not only do you need to know the comprehension of the text of Sharia, but and by that he means the theoretical part of Sharia, like the usul part. Not only do you need to know that, but you need to be intimately familiar with the judgments that have been handed down and put into the books of canonical law, and the books of the various schools of jurisprudence. So again, not only the usul, but actually the sort of fiqh. Not only the theory, but those essentially those judgments by which an actual human being, a faqih, had to make a judgment upon something, and those are written down in the books. And therefore, you need to be familiar with how essentially other judges came to make decisions in other cases and other scenarios that are found in the canon of law and in the books of fiqh. The third part is the necessity of the faqih as it relates to custom and culture in the comprehension of the situation at hand. So he says, حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف لفهم الواقع. This is the third major point. And this third point has actually three major points. So the first one is having a comprehension of the situation on the ground, وتحقيق المناط, and that having, like, what's the goal? Like, ما هي الغاية? What is the goal of even attempting to accommodate culture? What's the goal for it? وتنزيل الأحكام على الحوادث, and essentially taking things in a case-by-case scenario and making deductions from them. So this will essentially, this will be a deduction. And then the last item that he talks about is حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف, that the necessity of the faqih or the judge as it relates to custom is لمعرفة الناس, that it is that he or she must know the people. They must know the people. And again, when you say you must know the people, then a lot of, what's interesting about when you get into studying these things is that much of what you will need to know is implied rather than being explicit. It's not explicit. So you have to know the people. Well, what are the qualities that people have that you have to know? You have to know their customs, their culture, their language, their history, X, Y, and Z. So that's the fourth major point. Is حاجة الفقيه للعرف لمعرفة الناس, that you have to know the people. Yes, exactly. Yep. So is everybody familiar, since he's talking about the one clause in the third point where he talks about tanzil al-ahkami, it talks about the dealing of deduction in that point. He says, وَتَنْزِلُ الْأَحْكَامِ عَلَى الْحَوَادِثِ. This is essentially, I'm using this as a way to try to translate some of these extremely technical terms in the Arabic and in the Usul into a language in English that will make sense. So I'm choosing to summarize this phrase essentially as deduction based on scenario. If somebody wants to come up with a better a way of translating it, you're not bound to what I'm giving you. I'm just trying to make it as less cumbersome as possible. But going with the definition of deduction, is everybody kind of familiar with the definition of deduction? And I'm talking about from a sort of mantiq, like a logic point of view. So I'll just give a definition from the dictionary. It says a process of reasoning by which a conclusion follows necessarily from the premises presented. A conclusion reached by, and therefore, it said it follows necessarily from the premise presented, so that the conclusion cannot be false if the premises are also true. So this is getting into logic, but just I'm talking about deduction here, or this is essentially what Dr. Qata is suggesting, that how we will accommodate culture or some of our decision-making process will kind of be an act of deduction, and I'm going to leave it at that, not go into too heavy, because otherwise I feel that it will just become too cumbersome. Any other questions about anything talked about so far? Again, I will make the PDF, inshallah, available to anybody that wants to read. So, getting back to the thematic, why is it that we even need to have this conversation about the accommodation of custom in America? It's sort of a two-pronged thing. We're talking about accommodating American custom, but we're also talking about trying to manufacture our own American Muslim cultures and customs. So this is actually like an engine, it's a piston, it's like a push-pull thing here. This is not only a passive act of passing judgment upon America. Okay, yes, this is haram and this is halal, right? Anybody with a minimum amount of intelligence can say something such and such is not permissible. The harder part will actually be to say what is permissible, partly because that things are permissible until otherwise proven impermissible, and therefore they tend to sort of remain invisible. But the default mental state of Muslims in America, particularly those who have come to America, has been that everything is haram until proven halal. This is the exact opposite of how the Sharia works, is that something is permissible until it is proven impermissible. So just to lay out that what I'm talking about here is both a push-pull theory, that we want to be able to develop a system that allows us to pass judgment on certain American customs, to be able to figure out whether they're good for us or not good for us. But ultimately, we want to get beyond just being an executioner. This is that's not a really great job. Nobody wants to be an executioner. We actually want to get to the point where we want to become a manufacturer. We want to be able to create and manufacture our own legitimate American Muslim culture. And in fact, this has been done in every single Muslim country and society that we see. The problem is these things have taken place over hundreds of years, to the point that the gradations or the movements were so slow that when you look at it now, 500, 800 years after it happened, it just seems like, oh well, that's how it always is, and therefore that's how everything else has to be. And I think that's what sometimes makes this so difficult upon us, and that we sometimes second guess ourselves. Like, why are we in America talking about creating American Muslim culture or accommodating culture? Because in Saudi Arabia, we don't do this. Well, you do actually. You do it on a more subconscious level. You're doing it kind of on a more subconscious level, and also a lot of the heavy lifting was done for you many years ago, and that now you're able to just walk around. And in fact, that's one of the good things that, and probably can bring it up now, is that we want to essentially move the bulk of this conversation, which is really heady and really intellectual and really technical. We want to move the bulk of this conversation in a direction that we develop in intuition. And this is something that I really appreciate as a quote-unquote convert, is that Muslims that come from historical Muslim world don't tend to walk around with Sahih al-Bukhari or any of the books of hadith canon in their backpack, and Tafsir al-Qurtubi, and the Sharf of Alfiyat ibn Malik. They don't walk around with all of this intellectual baggage with them and then pull it out every time they want to cross the street or buy a sandwich, or they just, I'm from Turkey. This is what we do. And you will see that. I don't know if that's good or not. I just know in Turkey, this is what we do. I don't know if that's cool or not. I don't know, as I'm from Kuwait, this is what we do. I don't know if we do that in Pakistan. This is just what we do. And that, in some ways, that's a good place to be at, because it means that you have created an authentic Muslim culture that is able to do the bulk of the heavy lifting for you on a daily basis. That's a good place to be at. The danger is that if you don't manage it, you can forget that that is a process and not a result, right? That's a means and not an end. And that right now in America we tend to, it's like, hey, you want to go see a movie? Hold on, man. Let me ask At-Tabarani if I can go to the movies really quick. That's kind of like where we're at. And while it's all great and it's all intellectual and it's all heady, that doesn't make for a very fluid life. That you have to, at every street corner, you have to stop and ask directions, right? At some point, you just want to, if you go out of town, yeah, you might ask a stranger for directions. But in your own town, if you don't know how to get around, then you're probably a person that is either mentally incapacitated in some way, or you're drugged, or something else. You have some sort of disability. You shouldn't have to keep asking for directions in your own neighborhood. So that's kind of where we want to get at, where we develop a base familiarity and an intuition, like a gut level of where we can go, okay, yeah, I can deal with that, or nah, I'm not going to deal with that. Like that's one of the goals that we want to get at, with all of this. So I'm going to do some more Socratic method here by asking some questions. So there's two words. There's urf and then there's ada. These are kind of synonymous and interchangeable, customs or culture or whatnot, people's way of doing things. So what is a custom? What is a custom? What is an ada? What is a custom? Doing things in a certain way. Right. So what and what I'm going to really get at is, and essentially, what do customs do? They create a norm so that you can what? Well, just not that you can't drift, but the first part is what, so that you can do something, right? That's like customs essentially provide us a mechanism by which we can do things without being overly encumbered intellectually at every street corner that we come to. They help us to do a lot of thinking for us. It's like a program that runs in the background of your computer. When you're on your computer and you're on Facebook and you're, talking with your friends or whatever, there's actually probably hundreds of processes that are running in the background that make your computer work, right? You don't have to know all of the machine code and everything that's compiling and grinding away at 1,000 or 10,000 computations per second. You're like, I'm just chatting with my friends on Facebook. So in the same way, custom essentially is it's like a kind of unseen infrastructure. I mean, most of us, when we drive down the street, we don't really think about, wow, like somebody had to actually lay down asphalt on this street and make it smooth and pave it. But before that, they actually had to go and dig up rocks out of the ground and make asphalt. And they you're like, I gotta go to the store, right? You get in your car, and most of us don't have any idea how an automobile actually works. Like, we have no idea. It's like magic. When you turn the ignition, we honestly we just know that if I put this object called a key in this hole called the ignition, and I turn it and hold it for a second, and I hear a certain sound, all of those things mean that I can go to the store. None of us has any idea of electricity and sparks that fly. None of us have any idea about internal combustion and how this stuff works. I mean, there might be one, like somebody who works as a, engineer or something. When I say 99.9% of people that get in an automobile have no idea how that joker works. I give the example, I work in IT, actually. I have no idea, to be honest with you, really how this computer works. I know how to make it do things. That's my job, and I work in instructional technology. So my job is to help people use their computer or a piece of software to accomplish a goal. I have no idea honestly, behind the scenes, how this joker works. I couldn't even begin to tell you. I know nothing about code and all this other stuff and soldering boards and how a chip is made. I have no clue. And I don't need to know. Right? My job is to accomplish something on the computer. My job is to get in the car, go to the store, get some groceries, come home, and fix dinner for my family and have a good night's sleep. So in the same way, we want to be able to, again, to develop customs and cultures. Now, here's the thing. We don't want to have to manufacture every single custom. This will become unduly cumbersome and just simply untenable. Okay, great. Now we understand that, Islam can accommodate culture, so let's get down to the business of, let's get out our sort of like culture-making widget, and let's hammer out some customs and some cultures. That's not going to be a lot of fun. It'd be like working in a sweatshop, right? You're going to be working 20 hours a day to make 8 cents. That's just not going to work out very well. What you want to do is actually take a prefabricated model, right, and modify it. It's like a do-it-yourself project. This is essentially what we're talking about. This is why I'm going to try to use, I'm going to use a terminology here to try to unpack all this heavy stuff that I just said like 20 minutes ago, to try to put it in a framework that we go, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. So in the same way, and this is, again, what we're trying to do is exactly what every other Muslim country or society has done before us. We are not doing something new. This is not like ajib. This is not like, whoa, this is something, no. I'm a big Star Trek fan. And one of the great quotes from Star Trek was that, in Star Trek 4, Captain Kirk went back in the past, and this woman, when she found out that he was from the future, she's like, you're from outer space? He said, no, I'm from Iowa. I just work in outer space. So this is kind of like us. Like, we're not doing something, it seems really amazing, but in reality, it's like actually something pretty typical and common that all, societies and cultures or groups of people have had to do in the past. So being that we're not going to set about the project of fabricating every little nook and cranny and aspect of our culture, we are then going to have to appropriate the bulk of the culture around us and then pass it through a sieve. You know what a sieve is? A strainer. It's a fancy word for a strainer. What does a strainer do? It allows some things to pass through it, and it allows some things that don't, right? And that depending on what you want to sift, you will get a sifter or a sieve of which the holes are arranged in such a way that they will keep out what you want to keep out and let pass through what you want to keep. So if you have a sieve or a sifter that has really big holes, and the thing that you want to try to sift out is really tiny, are you going to be able to keep that out? No. It's all going to pass through. However, if you have a sifter that's essentially just a glass bowl, it gives the illusion of being transparent, and you want to say, oh, I want to filter this, are you going to be able to filter anything at all? No. So we have to essentially, and this is where he gets into this idea of, of a sort of per cases scenario, that you have to get down to the idea, as he says, وَتَنْزِيلُ الْأَحْكَامِ عَلَى الْحَوَادِثِ, that you have to take things in a case-by-case scenario. So depending on what we're trying to keep out or let through, we will have to be pliable and adjust. So we're not, this is not one size fits all. We have to remain adaptable, and this is going to be, in fact, a constant process. This is one of the reasons why cultures change over time. Cultures are not static. There are values, right? I mean, this is the thing. We need to differentiate between, our principles in Islam and our rules in Islam and our customs in Islam. Or as I'd say, really, our customs as Muslims. So a principle in Islam is that you pray 5 times a day. A principle in Islam is that Dhuhr has 4 units of prayer. It has 4 raka'at. This is why whether you pray Dhuhr 1,000 years ago, or you pray Dhuhr 1,000 years in the future, or if you pray Dhuhr on the surface of Mars, or you pray Dhuhr on the International Space Station, how many raka'ah for Dhuhr will there be? 4. Why? Why are there only 4 raka'ah for Dhuhr? That's it, right? So the point being is that this is why I was saying yesterday, Islam is not a culture. And I know there were some people that will differ with this because it begins to rearrange a lot of the furniture in their head in a way that makes them uncomfortable. But this is one of the reasons why Islam is not a culture. Because one of the principal characteristics of culture is that it does what? It changes. The principles of Islam do what? Never change. And I'm saying principles, not rules, we'll get into, right? I mean, when you talk about fiqh, right, when you talk about Islamic jurisprudence, what is fiqh? And I just gave you the definition. It's called Islamic jurisprudence. But what is fiqh? Right? See, sometimes we look for these. It's a human attempt to understand what God wants from us. It's a human attempt. This is why, okay, like I personally follow the madhab of Imam Malik. So I'm a Maliki, in terms of my fiqh, right? So there's different schools of thought. And, there's the Hanafi, the Hanbali, the Shafi'i, the Salafi, right? There's different schools of jurisprudence. All of them are human attempts to understand what Allah wants from us. Meaning that, this is why you see in the books of fiqh, right? Except for like fiqh of ibadat, except for, essentially those rules that again that relate to acts of worship. That's what I say. Dhuhr, there's no ikhtilaf, there's no difference of opinion in all the schools of thought on how many raka'at that you pray for dhuhr, or how many units of prayer that you pray for al-maghrib, right? There's no differences in those because that's what they call the fiqh of ibadat, right? This is the fiqh of worship. But when it comes to other things, right, when it comes to this like custom stuff, things can change over time. And this is just, so one is that what we're talking about, is a human endeavor, right? And that's why, again, one of the points I want to drive home is that the reason why we need to get in the business of starting to manufacture our culture is because we have been living under the false assumption and perhaps even delusion that Islam is a culture. It is not a culture. And the fact is, and that's not a negative, it's actually a positive. That's why Islam has such an effect on any culture that it interacts with, right? I mean, if you look, when Islam came to the Hijaz, it transformed the society. When Islam came to Iraq, it transformed the society. When Islam came to East Africa, it transformed the society. When Islam came to Indonesia, when it came to the archipelagos, it transformed those societies. So its transformative power is precisely because it's not man-made. Its transformative power is because it originates ultimately from beyond time and space. And therefore, it's important for us to preserve it as a non-artifact. It is not manufactured by the hand of man. This is why it has such transformative power. And that's why it can speak to any person and any time and any place. That's part of the reason why it has that capacity, is because it is not something that is in the timeline of existence. It doesn't come from within existence, it comes to existence, to transform existence. So now that we understand that customs, that they help us make decisions and they inform us. They help to inform us of things that are either good or bad, and right and wrong. And again, to demonstrate or to drive home the point of Islam not being a manufactured culture. It's not man-made. Allah says in Surah Al Imran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَلْكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And Allah says in the 3rd chapter, this is the 104th ayah of the 3rd chapter, He says, and let there be among you a community. وَلْيَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ. So let there be amongst from you an ummah, يَدَعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, calling to good. What I'm trying to illustrate here is the human endeavor to understand, because Allah does not tell us explicitly what is good. So there's a command here. وَلْيَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ. It's a command from God. It's one of the awamir. Let there be from amongst you a community. يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ. What is al-khayr? Don't say it's the good, because I just said the literal translation is it's the good. But what is good? Give me just really quickly, actually, every person, just think of one thing off the top of your head that you think is good. We'll go across the room. What's an example of something that's good? Anything, just anything that's good. Food. Anything, just off the top of your head, what's good? It could be an item, an action, whatever. What's good? Top of your head. Sports. No, but a thing, a person, a place, a thing, a noun, what? Helping people. Oh, like an organization to help people. The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. God is good. Taking good of elderly people. Oh, go, sure. Technology. You know what's so funny about this little quick exercise? It was so hard to think of what's good. You know why? Because it's so vast. This is the point. This is why this is a thinking man or a thinking woman's religion. Because وَلْيَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ. Let there be amongst you a community that calls to good. If we're commanded to call to good, but our response is, right? Shouldn't be this hard. What's good? Banana splits. What's good? Helping old people cross the street. What's good? Curing diseases. What's good? Fighting crime. What's good? Removing toxins from your environment. What's good? Visiting the sick. What? It's not that. It's, again, we have to develop an intuition. You're saying, what's good? The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, that's great. What is the Sunnah? 10 seconds, what's good? Like, I need, give me things obviously that is good, but you just gave me something that is, like, so vast that it would, like, go from, like, one end of the solar system to the other. This is why when you study, like, astrophysics, you begin to study, like, the universe, you have to express distances through what kind of mode? Exponents. You say, this planet is like X to the Y number of miles from this other place, right, from this asteroid or whatnot. Why? Why do you have to use exponents? Well, not only it's really far, but imagine if I said, this is 10 to the 9th power, right? If I had to write out those zeros, it'd be like, it would be so cumbersome to actually deal with the number versus a quick abstraction so we can get about the business of talking about the universe. This is why scientists come up with a language of abstraction that makes talking about the nature of the universe doable. See, these things are all right in front of us all the time. We think like, oh man, I should have paid more attention in astronomy class in high school. These things are in front of us all the time. We use abstraction so we can get down to the business of what we're abstracting about. So if we are supposed to be the community that calls to good, we need to be able to come up with pretty simple ideas of what's good. Now again, when we all, you tried to give a very nice religious answer, mashallah. What's good? The sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam, right? But what Allah is talking about here, if you're calling to good and you're trying to help people, then your definition of good is going to be primarily informed by your culture. Your culture and your customs are what inform you of what constitutes good. This is why the whole conversation about custom and culture is so important. And it shows that some of us have a little bit of sort of cultural calisthenics we need to do to get back in shape so that when we're asked like something that's good, we can just give an answer versus, all right, Alex, like dun 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 dun. Right? This is not that kind of thinking. This is not Islamic jeopardy. And then Allah goes on to say, وَيَأْمَرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ Urf, ma'aruf. These sound kind of like they might have the same root. And they command, يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. This is what's interesting here. So we're given explicit commands. Right? The command to be a community that calls to good is an explicit. It's not implicit. It's not implied. Allah is not sort of, no. Allah is be a community that calls to good. Be a community that commands al-ma'ruf. This is not implicit. This is explicit. But the definitions of what these things are of the good and al-ma'ruf, how do we know what is good? How do we know what al-ma'ruf? What is ma'ruf? Except that sounds kind of vague. And that's not necessarily good or bad, but it's just vague. I mean, again, the Quran is a universal message. Right? Even though this was revealed initially to the Arabs of the 7th century, if Allah had put in here, okay, Arabs really love, red camels, and they really love, dates, and they really love. Like, if it had just only been about an Arab aesthetic, then he would have actually put those things in there, and we would have no choice but to all be 7th century Bedouins. We'd have no choice. That would be. And yet, Allah is deliberately using slightly vague, universal language because He is counting on us, implied that we will be able to come up with definitions of good, the bulk of which, not all, but the bulk of which will come from our own cultures. So whatever I as an American think is good can be constituted as good so long as it does not contradict that which is explicitly bad in the book or in the Sunnah. Is everybody clear on the definition between implicit and explicit? So explicit meaning X on the outside. It's plain and simple. No guesswork. Boom. I can do it. Implicit means that I got to read into it a little bit to kind of try to figure out what was really meant. So if you ask me, how do you feel? I am tired and sleepy. Is that explicit or implicit? It's explicit. I am tired and sleepy. You don't need to interpret that in any, he is tired and sleepy. How are you feeling? I'm wiped out. If I tell you I'm wiped out, unless you actually see me looking like a piece of roadkill on the road that I just got hit by a bus, that is a implied meaning. I'm using words that are kind of vague. I'm wiped out. How is a person wiped? I mean, wiped. I mean, what is that? And yet, if I tell you I'm wiped out, you will immediately know that I am what? Tired. No guesswork whatsoever. What allows you to have certainty about this vague language that I'm using? Culture. Right? This is the power of culture. This is the power of custom. And this is exactly what our Creator is asking us to do. Now, as I said yesterday, America, one of the positive aspects of American culture, in my opinion, is that it is a service-based culture. You do a service in exchange for another service or some kind of economic reward in a fairly prompt manner. This is a good thing. And I know some people were like, I'm just saying. Look, I've been in the Muslim world. My experience is it's different. I'm not making an ultimate judgment value upon that part of the world as if Allah is displeased with them for not being a service-based culture. I'm just saying, as an American, I'm used to when I go up to the booth and ask for A, B, and C, I get A, B, and C in a very prompt and timely manner. I give you, 5, 10, whatever it is, I get my service and I go on my way. That's what I'm used to. And I think that, that can be a very good thing, that we live in a service-based culture. And we need to understand that many of the things in our cultural background as Americans will be 110% compatible with the ethics of Islam. So a service-based culture and society in which you give a straightforward service and you either get a straightforward service in return or a straightforward economic, gains in return. Alhamdulillah, this is a good thing. There are also other things in our society that are presumed to be good, but in fact are bad. One of them is the casual consumption of alcohol. Right? Most Americans consider 5 o'clock to be Miller time. No, I'm serious. People, we as Muslims, Friday, man, alhamdulillah, nahmadullah fa huwa al-yawm al-jum'ah. Like, thank God it's Friday, man, it's Jum'ah. I'm going to go to the masjid, I'm going to do. They're like, man, thank God it's Friday, man, I'm about to go drink myself under the table, right? Or even if you're not an alcoholic, right? I can't wait to get off work, man, go home, kick off my feet, kick off my sandals and my shoes and, throw a couple of brats on the grill, man, and, have me a couple of Heinekens, man, and just chill, right? People tend to think like that's not a bad thing to do whatsoever, except based upon this timeless, beyond the realm of human construction text. According to it, the consumption of alcohol is what? Not only is it impermissible, it's also what? It's not only bad for you, although the Quran says that there are benefits, but there are also things that are not good about it for you. Oh yeah, no, yeah, yeah. Let's take it to an emotional level. Drinking alcohol is displeasing to God. When we this is why I say when we develop a discourse of trying to give da'wah to people, alcohol is haram, alcohol is impermissible. The consumption of alcohol is displeasing to God. Our life, our whole existence in this life is trying to gain what? The pleasure of God. We have to change. See, this is why honestly, this whole thing about custom and culture, all this, man, is like our homework so that we can go and actually get down to the business. We're woefully prepared to give da'wah because we're not culturally affluent. We're monetarily affluent, right? Particularly the Muslim community in America is one of the most affluent demographics in the United States. Alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed our community with monetary affluence. We have very little culture affluence. We don't know how to speak to people, not just from a technical way, but from an emotional point. Urf, ada, al-ma'ruf, these things also put you into an emotional framework. Right? I mean, when you're reading this, you know, وَلْتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُوا إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. The other part, وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. What's munkar? Munkar. Basically, yeah. Munkar is basically bad things. That's a great way. What's munkar? Bad things. Allah doesn't list Allah doesn't say, and وَيَنْهَوْنَ, you know, عَلَى الزِّنَا وَيَنْحَوْنَ عَلَى الشُّرْبِ الْخَمْرِ وَيَنْحَوْنَ عَلَى الْمَيْسِرِ وَيَنْحَوْنَ عَلى الْقَطْرِ وَيَنْحَوْنَ. I mean, the book, the Quran would just, it'd be the size of Los Angeles. Right? But really simply, like, I have created you, O human being, into tribes and nations, so that you may what? Can know each other. Which means that you're also going to know yourself. It doesn't say wali ta'arafu, right? But you'll know yourself and you'll know other. You're gonna know. You're gonna know cultures. The whole point is like, you know, وَعَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ. I have taught you speech. Essentially, Allah has given us all these skills, all these innate, capacities, such that He can give us a small injunction of وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَلَى الْمُنْكَرِ, and we'll know how to act. Now we may have to, as Dr. Al-Qawta says, come to those وَتَنْزِيلَ the injunctions by which we have to come in a case-by-case scenario. But overall, we know that which is good and that which is bad, right? I mean, think about something like factory farming that we see now. And you see the way that the animals are treated. You see the way that people are actually harmed by this. I mean, factory farming doesn't just harm the animals, it also harms people, because people wind up eating the products of those factory farmed animals and they get sick and all this stuff, right? What do we need to necessarily go to the particular verse and letter and harf to be able to know that that's probably not a good thing? But if you see somebody abusing an animal, or we see those, we see these shocking videos from time to time, undercover videos of a factory farm, and you're just like, you're initially moved by that. You're like, oh my God, that's horrible. Your initial reaction is you're not like, your initial reaction isn't reciting the verse. It's just the blueprint of al-munkar, al-munkar is already in you, because we all come from cultures. Right? We not like just, oh man, that's bad. So what I'm trying to get at is, there are a great many things in our culture that will inform us about the world that will jive with Islam. There are some things, however, that will not, and that's why we have to take them on a case-by-case scenario and analyze them. Now, for really obvious things about alcohol, it's like, okay, that's really simple because it's in the Quran. But let's go into something controversial, like music. Right? Let's talk about music. Is music haram or is music halal? It depends on who you ask. Right? Here's the thing. There's valid opinions for both. There are valid opinions of music not being permissible. There are valid opinions for music being permissible. But even with those opinions for which music is permissible, there are still conditions by which something that can be permissible can be rendered impermissible. What's an example of that in the context of music? Let's just take, for the sake of conversation, that music is permissible. And matter of fact, music is permissible because we know that there were, people get into, musical instruments, different types of instruments. Okay, I'm just talking about music regardless of whether it's played on the duff and with the voice or whether it's on a saxophone. Just music is permissible because we know that music was performed in front of the Prophet ﷺ and he was complacent towards it. So again, I'm not talking about differentiation of tambourine and duff and hand and the voice and saxophone and the flute. I'm not getting to that. I'm talking about music. What if somebody starts cursing? Is that permissible? Why? Can anybody here right now recite me a hadith or a verse of impermissibility of lewd language? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, I'm talking about explicit. Right, you just made it, just barely. Right? My point is, you know this, but you know it on an intuitive level. Right? You don't have to go, hold on, I just heard that Jay-Z lyric and I know that like, nah, man, that's crazy, man. So, very recently, there was a big controversy in our community over a video produced by some young Muslims. Some of you may have heard of. They were called Mipsters, the Muslim Hipsters. If you don't know, it was a music video that some Muslims made that showed young Muslim women mainly prancing around and dancing and just kind of being silly and having fun. And in the it was put to the soundtrack of a very popular rapper that involved some very distasteful language. And of course, people flew off the chain and were, berating them and going off on them. And so I had released, a short video actually, kind of trying to give a balanced critique of it. And I said that, actually I was happy to see that there were some young Muslims that had some creativity and some energy and decided to produce a piece of fun artwork because Muslims need to have fun, right? However, some of the critiques of it were valid in the fact that, at least in my opinion, one of the things that I didn't like is that, they chose, not that they chose to use music in the video, but is that they took the cheap way out and put in a music video, put in a music soundtrack that had vulgar language. And that they didn't take the time to be creative to put in a soundtrack that would have been free of vulgar language. And you can't tell me that the only way that you can have cool or hip music is if somebody's cursing in it. Like, I just don't believe that. So my critique was not the music, but the substance of the music, which made it impermissible and made it vulgar and made it a bad choice. Because again, our culture and our customs should inform us. And as Muslims, we want to have a culture that ultimately informs us to making good decisions. Right? And I think that's one of the things for young Muslims today. We need to develop a Muslim culture in America that can moralize being cool. I'll repeat again, we need to develop a culture in America amongst Muslims that moralizes being cool. Because whether we like it or not, and some of us have forgot because it's, some of us more than others, been quite a while since we were young, but when you're 13 years old, 14 years old, 15 years old, what's the most important thing in the world? Being cool. Being cool is more important than anything when you're at that age. And that is obviously a kind of sunnah that Allah has put into young people. It's part of the insanity of being young, is that you want to be cool and you want to do sort of crazy things. We are not going to be able to change that which Allah has created. We cannot undo it. But we can alter it in such a way that we provide an avenue that young people can be cool, but they can still be moral. And that was the conversation I essentially had with the people that made the video. I felt bad that people just kind of really, lambasted them. And I said, look, the problem isn't the music. The problem is the substance of the music. And there were some other things, and the women weren't quite perfect. I was like, yeah, but it's fun. Dudes walk around all the time not perfect. People that have beards that don't grow them, and I'm not bashing. I'm just saying you have people that have beards and don't grow them. You have guys that wear super biker, short bike messenger shorts, and you go to Jumu'ah and people are bending over and revealing themselves, and like nobody's going all crazy because the guys are doing it, right? One woman, like, oh my God, a little lock of hair. It's like people are going crazy. So part of the whole hysteria about the video is that it was women that did it, not men. If guys had done it, they'd probably be like, oh man, that's pretty cool, man. Jay-Z, look at those guys. They would have had a very different approach to it. So part of it, was that women had did it, and people kind of flew off the chain about it. But we need to try to provide spaces, and those means physical spaces, but also mental spaces, emotional spaces, where we demonstrate to our youth that yes, you can be young, you can have fun, you can be cool, and you can still be moral, right? You cannot tell me that the only way to have fun as a 16-year-old kid is to run around, smoke weed, get drunk, and have extramarital sex. You can have fun as a young person without having to engage in those things. What we need to do is take this beyond the pamphlet level of me just saying you can do it, to the point where we actually have a construct where they can actually see that demonstrated and then live it themselves. But that will only come through a custom and a culture, because again, most of their concepts of what constitutes being cool and fun will be informed by what? Popular culture. This is where it gets into, I don't want to say like a game of cat and mouse, but the stakes become high because the popular culture is very attractive, and that we will never succeed by just saying, it's all haram and turning our backs on it. That's just not going to work. But also then just saying like, well, that's not going to work either, right? I mean, opening up that floodgate will also, it's kind of like we need to have something, again, like a sifter that's going to let through what we think is good to let through, and will keep out what we want to keep out. And I know that this right now is sort of like the theoretical level. So one of the things that will help maybe to explain this, and I don't know, before we get into the inception part, I'll sort of stop here for a moment and say, does anybody have any questions, or you need to stretch your legs or anything? Any questions so far? Comments? Even comments, questions, before we go further? Sure. Yes, right. I mean, to maybe make it um, more visible. Okay, the idea of al-ma'ruf wal-munkar. So ma'ruf are things that are generally good, and al-munkar are things that are generally bad. These are like two big containers that are empty, in that essentially these are two containers that sit outside our existence, right? Because the Quran is being revealed by God. God is outside of existence. This is why he's saying, command to that which is good. Ma'ruf, which means, arafa. The verb, the verbal root for this, right? This is ma'ruf. It's like, again, it's another masdar. We're getting into another a verbal noun. Arafa in Arabic means what? To know. Al-ma'ruf means that which is known. Or as implied here, that which is known to be good. Nakar is something bad, and therefore, again, the masdar, that which is known to be bad. They are these sort of like prefabricated receptacles of which they are then given to us, and we have to fill them. But as we pour whatever we think is good into the receptacle of ma'ruf, and as we pour whatever we think is, bad into the receptacle of munkar, that sieve on top of that container, that filter, is the Quran and the Sunnah. Most of it will be the Sunnah. Because there are actually very few, ayat of ahkam in the Quran. I mean, most of the rules that we get from the Quran, only a few of them are actually explicit. The majority are implicit, which we must then extrapolate from the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So essentially, al-ma'ruf and al-munkar are two giant repositories that Allah gave us that sit outside the construct of our culture. The idea of ma'ruf in terms of its construct, that is something that is created by God, is not manufactured and man-made. We put man-made items into al-ma'ruf. But the filter of what ultimately decides what goes in the receptacle of ma'ruf, that filter is the implicit and explicit injunctions in the Quran and the implicit and explicit injunctions from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and then obviously, the human attempts to understand those things from our scholars and the legal tradition and so on and so on. Does that? It's hard. The language is still really cumbersome. It's like describing a lot of this is like, man, what is he, it's like I'm trying to describe, imagine trying to describe this in intimate detail to like a blind person. It's really simple, but it's like, it's kind of, it's this small white thing. Well, small, what is small? I mean, the only way that you understand small is, how small is small? Small in relation to what? The moon is small in relation to the earth. The moon, in relation to me, is massive. So, sometimes we are still at the infancy of this thing, particularly amongst ourselves as Muslims in America, of kind of developing this language of describing all of this, and that's why some of it's still so clunky. You're probably all sitting here going, man, I had no idea this talk was going to be this difficult. But again, we're the people that are going to be doing some of the heavy lifting. Hopefully 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now, when our kids or our grandkids are here, I pray that we're able to not leave as many heavy objects for them to lift, that we begin to build some of this that will make it easier for them. Yeah, sure.
So is it the job of the leaders of the community to decide how much religion is halal, how much participation of those school activities is permissible or acceptable, or is that judgment of the individual, whoever is the man of the household is going to allow that much dealing with those kind of challenges.
Mm. Uh, I mean, simple answer, yes. To break it down a little bit, is the job of the leaders? Yes. What constitutes a leader? Right? I mean, that's... Yeah, and even, I mean, it's weird. Like, I'm going to presuppose the whole reason why you have me sitting here in front of you, running my mouth, and you're listening and writing down what I'm saying, is because you view me in some way or another as some kind of leader, which makes me extremely uncomfortable. However, are you necessarily following me? No. I mean, it's okay. I mean, I'm not going to like, you better follow me. No, you're not following me. And yet, you're here to try to learn or benefit or, right? So understand that when we talk about leadership, I mean, this isn't the military, right? I mean, I'm not your senior commanding officer of which, I can have you put in the brig if you don't obey my orders. That's not what this is. So the relationship between leaders and followers in a non-militaristic, situation is more fluid. I mean, I'm here because I think I have something beneficial to offer. You're here because you at least think that maybe that's true. You'll make a decision after this is all done. And then when you leave from here, if you probably feel like, you know what, what he had to say, that's cool. I'm gonna take that to heart. I'm gonna try to do, and therefore you will go back to your household or do whatever. If you're like, man, this guy is crazy as the squirrels outside, right? And therefore you're not under any obligation to have to do what I say. And this is the nature of leadership in the community, is that ultimately it's going to have to withstand the test of acceptance from the followers. So it's more, my basic point is that, yes, but it's more fluid. It's just not okay, I've given the orders, start marching. It's not that, not that simple. So to transition, before we go, there was an interesting, just an interesting hadith. We're talking about music. Has anybody heard of the Banu Arfida? There's a group of people called the Banu Arfida. Yeah, they came from Al-Habasha. Anybody know the story about so we were talking about music. And this is very, very interesting. So there was a situation in which a group of Ethiopians, Abyssinians, came to celebrate. And it was one of the holidays. And they came to the masjid. So I'll read just the text real quick and give a brief translation. And it says, دخل عمرو والحبشة يعلبون في المسجد فزجرهم عمرو فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم دعهم عمرو فإنما هم بنو أرفدة. So there was a situation where during one of the Eid celebrations, Omar entered into the mosque and he found a group of people from Abyssinia, from Habasha, which is the place where the first immigration, the first hijrah actually was to, right, Al-Habasha. وَيَلَعَبُونَ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ. And they were like basically playing. They were singing and dancing and, and playing music and doing this thing, in the masjid. In the masjid. Right? And understand, did the Muslims have a masjid in Mecca? No. They had what they called the Dar al-Arqam, right? The house of Arqam that they used to try to meet at in secret. So my point is, if this is taking place in the masjid, what masjid is this? Yeah, what other masjid is there? Right? Again, this is a hadith about the Prophet in the time of the Prophet. If there was no masjid in Mecca, they were where? In Medina. In the Prophet's masjid, alayhi salawatu salam. So Omar, our favorite John Wayne figure, enters into the masjid and finds these people singing and dancing and does what? He does what Omar would do. Man, just singing and dancing in the masjid, man. Don't you know you're in the Prophet's masjid? فزجرهم عمر فقال رسول الله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم دعهم عمر. So, of course, Omar's like, take this nonsense somewhere else. And the Prophet says to Umar, دعهم عمر. Umar, leave them. Leave them be. فإنما هم بنو عرفدة. Because they are the tribe of Arfida. He doesn't say, leave them alone because it's implied, leave them alone because I said so, because who am I? I'm the Prophet, and I am what? The ultimate authority in the religion. If I say it's raining outside, it's raining. Don't even, gotta look up at the clouds, man. If I say it's raining outside, it's raining. Right? The ultimate authority. دعهم عمر فإنما هم بنو عرفدة. His justification of leaving them alone is not because what they're doing is permissible, right? In terms of he's making, it's implied that it's permissible because he's saying leave them alone. But he's not being explicit. He gives no explicit explanation except for the fact that they are what? No. They are Banu Arfida. The reason to leave them alone and let them do what they do is because they are who they are. Are you following me? This is what they do. They are Banu Arfida, and Banu Arfida does this, and therefore leave them alone. The reason why they are doing what they're doing is because this is what they do. And I, as the ultimate religious authority, am telling you it's okay in my masjid. Right. But he doesn't say it's their custom. That's implied. He just says, فَإِنَّمَا هُمْ بَنُوا عَرْفِدًا. This is why it's also, we sometimes tend to pay very close attention to the language of the Quran, and for good reasons. But the Prophet ﷺ was also extremely eloquent and chose his words, and they are also equally worthy of investigation. His reason for leaving them alone and doing what they do is not given an explicit explanation. It is just leave them alone because they are who they are. Now, in this, they are not what? Right, they are not Quraysh. They are not Qurayshi. They're not Arabs. They're not like who? Umar. Right, we have essentially here a clash of cultures. And Umar naturally reacted to what they were doing based upon what he knew as what? An Arab. Yes, he's partly informed by his religiosity, and this goes to show you, that isn't alone necessarily enough to come to just conclusions. Omar objects to them based on a cultural understanding that has been informed by his religiosity and says, hey man, take this nonsense out the masjid. Omar da'ahum fa innama hum banu arfida. Omar, leave them alone because they are who they are. They are Banu Arfida. And what they're doing here is as natural to them as you and I drinking water. This is what I mean about the role of of essentially ascribing a sense of religiosity or a sense of Islamicity, if I may, to those things that in themselves, on first glance, may not even appear to be, one, permissible, or two, very religious. But this was a celebration of one of the Eids, and this celebration took place in a sacred location. I mean, Masjid al-Nabawi is one of the most sacred places in the entire universe. And he let them basically do their thing. So this gives us kind of a template. Now again, I'm not talking about, this is not the same that, oh, you know, their customs as Abyssinians were to, you know, eat pork and drink wine. Okay, Omar, let them be. Obviously he can't do that because that's against, right? But it's very interesting. Our preconceived notions of, you know, this or that is haram. Like I said yesterday, a lot of times when people talk about this or that is haram, what they really mean is, I don't like it. But I don't like it is not a madhab. And we have to be extremely careful, one, of rendering things that we don't like impermissible, simply based on the fact that we just don't like it. Matter of fact, some of the rulings in fiqh, when you get into it, there's this category that's called makruh. And when you study some of the four schools, like, you know, having studied, you know, some of, you know, we'll study in the Maliki madhab and a little bit of the Hanafi and the Shafi'iyya, you will sometimes find Imam Malik will make a ruling that he says, he doesn't say, hada haram, he will say, la akrahu hada. He doesn't say this is haram, he says, I don't like that. ولا يفعل, you know, ولم يفعل, you know, ولا يفعل شخص بعد. Nobody ever did that. That's a very different ruling. Now again, Imam Malik is one of the most authoritative voices in the post-prophetic period, right? I mean, he's one of the founders of one of the major schools of thought in Muslim law. So, I mean, obviously, what he has to say carries a tremendous amount of weight. It's not the same as anything that either Allah or His Messenger would say, but nonetheless, if Imam Malik says something, it does carry a tremendous amount of weight and authority to it. And because he himself knows that he is seen as the Imam of Medina, he doesn't issue these things just willy-nilly, this is haram, this is haram. He says, La akrahu hada. I don't like that. Meaning that, you know, maybe you could do that, but I'm a pious person. I'm one of the most knowledgeable people. I don't like that. So that's nuance. And again, that's a lot of what we're missing here. When you say something is haram, then we'll get onto the inception part. When you say something is haram, what does this mean? Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, technically, although we call it Masjid al-Haram, right? We don't mean it's forbidden, it's actually sacred. Yeah. But I'm just being facetious. When we say something is haram, we mean it's forbidden, but what do we mean ultimately? Oh, it's not just forbidden. See, I'm trying to get you to think one or two chess moves ahead. Well, it's obviously displeasing to God, and so displeasing that what? He might just throw your butt into hellfire. Right? When you say that something is haram, it means that if you do not cease and desist from the action and make tawbah for doing it, Allah has every right to put you in the hellfire, perhaps even for eternity. That's pretty heavy. So you're telling me if I go to see a movie, it's haram. Now I'm saying there might be some movies that are haram, right? I mean, a pornographic movie is haram. But I shouldn't really even have to really put, that's kind of like that's being redundant. A pornographic movie is haram. It's like, but movies, like, again, just the sort of like template, a movie, like me watching, you know, Winnie the Pooh with my child. I mean, if I watch Winnie the Pooh with my 2.5-year-old daughter, I don't turn it off, never turn it back on, and don't make tawbah, that Allah will put me, has every right to put me into hellfire potentially for eternity. Does that sound right? Especially for Winnie the Pooh. However, we have people that say going or watching movies are haram. That's why sometimes when people come to me and they say, well, what about this or that? And I will try to, actually, unless I know it is explicit, what do you think about, so we know pork is haram, right? But you have like synonyms for pork. So, what do you think of prosciutto? Yeah, it's haram, right? But, we need to develop this nuance. So, for instance, also in the Maliki madhab, there's an exception that is different from the other madhab when it comes to dogs. And the exception is primarily based around the saliva of the dog. So Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Hanbal and Imam Abu Hanifa, they all consider the saliva of the dog to be impure or najis. So if it licks you or licks in your bowl or something, you have to, clean yourself and wash yourself, and you have to wash out the bowl. Imam Malik does not consider the saliva of the dog to be najis. He doesn't differ on the idea of keeping the dog in the house, right? I mean, a dog should essentially be a work animal. You can either keep it for like hirasa, like a guard dog, or it could be like a shepherd or hunting or whatnot. But the saliva part, Imam Malik disagrees. He says, no, I don't believe that, I don't believe the saliva of the dog is najis. So because of this, in America, the Maliki madhab, due to some articles that were published perhaps and understood out of context, has become the new favored madhab of converts. I'm going to join the Maliki madhab because I can have a dog. And therefore, Fido, I can go back to the great old days of Fido sleeping in the bed with me and we could be best friends and whatnot, right? This is not what was implied by Imam Malik of having your dog sleep with you in the bed. But I'll give an example in terms of, on one hand, providing an understanding of Islam that will accommodate, but at the same time, putting limits on it. So there was a brother that came to me, and he's like, is it haram to have a dog? I said, no, Allah will not put you in the hellfire for eternity for having a dog. Sort of, he's like, well, I just became a Muslim about a year ago, and, I have an animal, and I was really actually thinking of not converting because I felt I would have to put my animal to sleep just to become Muslim, and that was emotionally very difficult for him. And I said, no, you don't have to put your animal to sleep. Obviously, you should try to keep the animal outside the house and whatnot. So he went on being Muslim for a period of time, and then he came back to me, and he was like, I want to get another dog. And I said, okay, well, you've been Muslim now for a little while. You understand the rules. I said, what kind of dog are you going to get? I was like, I was just thinking get like this little kind of dog, and meaning a house dog, and da. I said, that's not permissible. And he said, well, wait a minute. I said, you came to me as a new convert that was, or on the cusp of conversion, and what was potentially holding you back was putting your animal to sleep. So obviously the greater concern was to allow you to become Muslim. Now that you've been Muslim for a little while, you're going to have to deal with Islam. And by all consensus, nobody's signing off on some dog sleeping in the bed with you. Right? Now, if you want to get on the dog and it's going to be outside, a work dog, a guard dog, mumtaz, no problem. You want to just have some dog sleeping with you in the house? No, you need to have a sense of maturity and deal with what Allah essentially is commanding you to do. So my point being is that, we have to have a sense of maturity as we talk about this accommodation of culture. That sometimes, and that's why I said, you have to have an understanding of the situation at hand. And that's one of the things that he talked about, is that you have to have, حاجة الفقيه إلى العرف لفهم الواقع. One of the obligations upon the faqih, upon the jurist, as it relates to culture, is an understanding of the situation on the ground. The situation on the ground was, I'm not sure whether or not I want to become Muslim because I don't want to put my dog to sleep. I'm thinking that, من قال لا إله إلا الله دخل الجنة. Whoever says La ilaha illallah will go into paradise. I want you to go to paradise, right? Therefore, become Muslim, we'll deal with the dog kind of thing. Fast forward, been Muslim for a year or two, I want to have another dog in the house, time to grow up. Time to deal with this deen as a fully fledged, responsible Muslim, which means that, again, you may be inconvenienced on some levels by some things in the deen. And we have to have the spiritual maturity that can deal with occasions of being inconvenienced, knowing that we're seeking the pleasure of God, right? Because having a dog in the house with you is something displeasurable to God. So I just say that to lay out that we talk about this engagement of culture, that we also have to have this idea of we have to have an understanding on the ground. So in the beginning, the situation on the ground was, I just need you to get into Islam. The situation 2 years ago, I need you to grow up. So that changes, right? So situations may change, and therefore I may give one ruling at one point and then give another ruling in the other that might seem contradictory. And I'm just saying, like me, I'm just saying we, this is part of this enterprise. Any questions? You're all thinking about what kind of dog you'll get. The Maliki Madhab is very attractive. Just be careful about praying with your hands at your side. So, has anybody seen the movie Inception? You haven't seen this movie? Brother Rashid? Man. You gotta rent this movie, man. It's great. So for those that don't know, Inception is this kind of, mind-bending movie about people that are able to engage in shared dreaming. And they enter into a dream world, and these worlds have different layers. And in this world, or in the narrative of the story, the characters are called upon to have to introduce an idea into a person's mind artificially, in such a way that it will take root, that it will seem like it's the person's own idea. And that's why I love the story of it, because one, it's just kind of cool, it's a neat movie. But as I was watching this movie, I was sitting there with like my notepad, just constantly scribbling down, because I'm like, this is what we're trying to do. This is essentially very similar to what we're trying to do in this talk about creating, like this is getting to the part about creating culture, right? So we've talked about this about accommodating, now we're getting to the part talking about creating culture. And that one of the things that creates the world for these dreamers in this dream construct is their subconscious. And that's what I was saying before. Part of the goal of all of this is to develop an intuition, something on a subconscious level. Right now, everything is very conscious. Like that's why it's hard. What's good? You're not coming at this from a gut level. You're not coming at it quite yet from an unconscious level of what's good? Strawberries, that kind of thing. That's what we want to get, particularly for our kids, to develop an intuition, right? Something on a subconscious level that, being Muslim, being cool, being moral, praying, being good to people, but subconscious. This becomes like their just behavior. It just becomes how they act. And that there's one part in the movie where Leonardo DiCaprio's character is explaining the dream world to this young girl who's going to come and be part of their team. And as they're in this, they're kind of like in a test construct for the dream world. And at one point, as the dreamers draw more and more attention, or they become more aware of like how strange the dream world is, like, oh, we're dreaming, the people within the dream world begin to kind of attack them. And one of the things that made me think about this is that this dunya is not permanent. It seems really permanent. But we all know, وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. the hereafter is what's really permanent. This life is not permanent. And therefore, and we sometimes feel like this. Living this life sometimes feels like a dream. Kind of, sometimes. I mean, sometimes it feels like a dream. One of the interesting things about a dream, anybody that's ever had one, we've all had dreams, and he points this out in the movie, is, do you ever remember entering into your dream? You're just there, right? Like, I had a dream that, I was, at the Prophet's masjid, and that, we've all had that kind of dream. I dreamed this dream, but you don't remember, like, I remember getting my passport stamped, and I remember, talking to my travel agent. No, you don't. You're just like, I was there. You're just like, your dreams are like that. You just sort of like, you don't remember how you got there or when you got there. You're just there. Our lives are like that in many ways as we are born. Like, nobody remembers their birth. Right? I mean, this is the kind of scary part now with like modern technology. My daughter will probably be like, like, I have the pictures of you coming into this world. Right? I mean, that's kind of crazy now that, people film these things and whatnot, and we're so excited. But nonetheless, 20 years from now, I can go and show my daughter, like, look, this is you coming into the world. She'll be like, I don't remember that. Right? You don't remember it. And yet, here you are. Here I am. Here we are. None of us remembers any of that stuff. So, in many ways, this life has similar qualities to a dream world. We develop our consciousness that one day, we're just who we are. Many of us have murky, at least for me in particular, like, it's hard for me to, I have memories of my childhood, but they're memories, they're not like, it's not a YouTube video. It's not like, I can, rewind back to 1 minute and 28 seconds of, September 12th in 1981. I don't have that kind of memory. None of us has that. And that's why I'm using this. So, part of it is getting back to the dream world and how when they began to realize that the dream world was a dream, the people in the dream world began to attack them. And you have to understand in the same way, when the Prophet ﷺ began to tell the Quraysh, hey man, this thing ain't real. This is not permanent. إِذَا كُنَّ عِذَامًا نَكِرًا. You mean to tell me that I'm going to die and that I'm going to become dried, withered bones? وَتِلْكَ إِذًا كَرَّةٌ خَاسِرًا. And that you mean I'm going to go into the dirt, become dried bones and dust, and then I'm going to be made whole again? Come on, man. What, this is, sihrun mubin. This is like magic. This is like sorcery. This is a fairy tale that you're telling me. People like the Quraysh got really upset. Matter of fact, today, a lot of people, when you begin talking to people about we're going to die and we're going to be resurrected and we're going to be put back into our bodies are going to be whole again and flesh again, people get really what? They get upset. They get scared. They get mad. And they may even attack you. I mean, not physically, but, people, now that's why you have this sort of like new hostile atheism that's really, really, hostile towards any kind of theology. You start telling people that this life isn't it, people will get potentially hostile. This is why I like this movie. It's so many amazing examples of like, because I've had young kids come to me like, well, why don't people like us as Muslims? I'm like, don't get overly committed to like the political reasons of why, like Fox News type stuff. That's child's play. Partly because, number one, there's big money in that. Right? I mean, there's, you want to advance your career, just don't like Muslims. Write a book about it. I mean, that's a quick way. So that's very simple. But you start telling people that this life isn't real, people will not like you. I mean, again, in the prophetic period, one of the major points of contention that the Arabs had with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam It was like, you're telling me that this isn't it. And these were people that actually, in their own way, they believed in Allah. This is why you find Jahili Arabs with the name Abdullah. Because they believed, obviously they didn't believe in him correctly, but they did believe in Allah. But then, wait a minute, this idea of coming back, that this isn't it? No, this is it. You start telling people this isn't it, right? So that's one of the interesting things about the movie. What I found really illustrative about some of the dialogue in the movie as it relates to this talk about culture is that Leonardo DiCaprio's character, again, is hired by this business mogul to essentially kidnap this guy who's the son of this like multi-billionaire, magnate. So this guy's father owns this huge energy corporation that's almost like a monopoly of energy companies around the world. And his competitor wants to hire Leonardo DiCaprio's character to kidnap his son, put him in this dream world, and implant the idea in his head that he should break up his father's empire so that, it won't be a monopoly anymore. So he's trying to go and hire different people on his team that will be able to help him execute this plan. So one of the characters in the movie, who's played by Tom Hardy, his name is Eames, he's this kind of like swashbuckling kind of guy. He's very, has a lot of swag and he's charismatic. And they begin to have this conversation about how do you do inception. And the idea of inception is, again, planting an idea in somebody's mind, even though the idea in itself is artificial, it will take root in the person's mind as if it is organic, and then they will then own it and believe it themselves. So Leonardo DiCaprio's character is like, how do I do this? How am I going to implant the idea in this guy's mind that he should break up his father's company, right? And he gives one example. He says the problem of trying to give somebody an idea is that they will always know, or more than likely they will know, that the idea isn't originally theirs. So he gives the idea, if I tell you, don't think of elephants, what do you think of? Elephants. Like it's inevitable. And yet, if I told you, oh, well, that idea of not thinking of elephants, that's your idea. You were like, no, you just told me don't think of elephants. Like you will know that I gave you the idea about elephants, even though I'm telling you not to think about it. So this is one of the problems or one of the challenges of creating, because ultimately we are not creators. That's what I'm saying. We can't even Einstein on a sort of Islamic level had it right? You cannot create or destroy matter. It can only be changed or sort of transmuted. So we are not really attempting to create or destroy, but we are just simply trying to manufacture out of pre-made things, right? Allah has already made all of the necessary elements. We're just trying to assemble them in the right order in a way that will be beneficial to us. And he says the method of doing this, of trying to plant this idea in this guy's head, of making inception, and I'm using this as a parallel of trying to make and create a bona fide American Muslim culture. He says that you have to start with the simplest version of the idea. And this we actually see is very much true with the way that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the way that he delivered the message of Islam, the way that he taught Islam to people, is that he gave it to them in the simplest way possible, so that the idea of Islam would grow organically in their minds. This is why I love this movie. It's like, wow, if you just put a beard on Leonardo DiCaprio, like this is a very Muslim movie. As a matter of fact, I'll give you the link. There's an article written by a scholar that actually writes also about this movie Inception, and also links it to essentially like Islamic theology and spirituality. It's an excellently written article. I have it on my website, and I highly encourage you to read it. It's really, really fascinating. And what I liked about this movie is that, there's a little bit of violence in the movie, but no graphic violence. There's no nudity. It's overall like a pretty decent movie to watch. I wouldn't let like a 5-year-old kid watch the movie. And obviously you as man of the house, you can come to make your own decisions. But it's a movie that's not incredibly offensive. I mean, there's not like overt drug use or drinking or overly sexual. I mean, it's overall like a pretty decent movie to watch. And I like it because it allows us to sometimes have a visual translation of things that are sometimes very mentally hard to grasp. Like right now, it's like, okay, I'm trying to stay with you. You're using words that I used to, when I had to take the GRE 20 years ago, but I'm having a hard time hanging with you. So it's, it's a fascinating movie. So he says that, you start with the simplest idea to implant it in the person's head. So creating this idea of Muslim culture, we have to, again, when I gave the example of what is good, you're like, it's an organization that's going to start with the simplest idea, right? I mean, the simplest idea is actually, Allah says, and do good, ummatun yad'una ila al-khayr. That's the simplest idea, is just a community that calls to good. Then we begin the idea of what constitutes good from the most basic things. And then you move forward. Just like when you're teaching your young children. As your children are born and they grow up, they become like 2 or 3 years old. You don't sit down with, your 3-year-old kid, okay, we're going to go over the Mudawwana of Imam Malik, of, deep issues of fiqh. I'm like, no, it's beyond the capacity of a 3-year-old kid, right? You go, okay, you want to pray with mom and daddy? Okay, you just start with the simplest idea, such that by the time your kid is like 10 years old, they're praying. It becomes organic. It's, again, so just so that we begin to see these ideas. And he said that, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he's like, have you tried this before? And he said, yes, and it didn't work, though. And he said, oh, you didn't go deep enough. And he said, no, it's not about depth. See, sometimes we think like you have to create these really complicated. He said, it's not about depth. It's about actually starting with the simplest version of the idea. So when they begin to talk about how to execute this, and he's giving him some information about this guy, like, okay, his father's this big businessman, and here's his kid. And he said, in order to be able to plant this idea in this guy's mind, it's not going to be about various political reasons that this guy might want to hang on to his father's company because, he wants to be wealthy, he wants to have power, not these political reasons. He said, if you want to get to that, you have to start with the simplest thing, which is the relationship with the father. Why would he want to break up this? You have to first figure out what is the relationship between the son and the father. When you understand that relationship, then you'll be able to understand how to craft the idea. And for us, it's similar. We have to understand, that's what I said, we need to understand American history intimately. Like, we need to understand, how did this country come about? What happened? That's why I gave the example yesterday. Like, what happened in the 1960s? People were like, civil rights? If you don't know what happened in America between like 1920 and 1970, you really need to go do your homework. You need to know what happened in this country. Because you have come here at a very interesting time. And will help you to understand, when you look out in the street and like, man, these people are crazy. They are. But there's a method to their madness. You need to understand how people are crazy. Right? I mean, when somebody is taken to, a mental institution that are, maybe they've lost their mind or something, they just go, that dude's crazy, lock him up. No, they diagnose them. They try to figure out, well, is it a chemical imbalance? Do they have PTSD? Have they gone through some kind of trauma? Right? You have to triage and diagnose. You just don't put people in a straitjacket and throw them in a room and lock the key and throw away the room. That's not how you treat madness. So in the same way, when we look out here, we will see crazy things out here, no doubt. But there's a method to the madness. And if we want to be that community, وَلْيَكُنْ right? وَلْيَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُوا إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. If we want to be that community that Allah commands us to be, let there be a community from amongst you that calls to good and that commands to that which is known to be good and forbids that which is known to be evil. Then we're going to have to understand the methods of their madnesses if we're going to be able to do this. And don't think that you will be immune to the madness just because, well, I live in my little gated community. This is, no. We are a part of the society, and we will be susceptible to whatever is out there. We can't escape it because, again, we're not going anywhere. Therefore, we have to meet this challenge head on. We have to be that community. Now, what's interesting is in the ayah that I recited from Surah Ali Imran, wal yakun, right? Let there be. I mean, it's interesting. If Allah says, let there be a community from amongst you, wal takun minkum ummatu yad'una ila al-khayr. He's saying, let there be a community, which means that, okay, maybe there will be a community that will call to good, and maybe there won't be. But for us, what community do we want to be a part of? We want to be a part of the community that's calling to good. Or are we just sort of like, I'm a conscientious objector. I don't want to be part of that community that's going to call to good. Right? So again, the subtlety of the language of the Quran is that, one, it's addressing the fact that the reason why he's saying is let there be a community from amongst you, because one, he knows some of you aren't going to want to do this. So you're going to have to be pushed out of your comfort zone in order to do this, right? Wal takun, right? It's a very subtle command. It doesn't just say kunu, right? That would be, right? Like kulu min tayyibat. That's a straightforward command. Eat from that which is good, like just straightforward command. Or hurrimat alaykum, right? Forbidden for you are, lahm al-khanziri and so on, like straightforward. Wal takun minkum. So he's actually addressing, Allah is actually addressing all of us. Minkum. But let there be a group from amongst all of you. But again, like, I mean, it's like when you go to the basketball court and you see a winning team, like, man, those guys are, they've won 3 or 4 games in a row, like that's the good team. Like, what team do you want to play on? You don't want to play on the guys that have been like waiting to get in that, they got bumped out in the first round. Like, I want to go play, because why? You're not going to play. Nobody signs up on the losing team to be losers. We want to be winners. This is a natural part of who we are as human beings. وَفِي ذَلِكَ فَلْيَتَنَافَسِ الْمُتَنَافِسُونَ. Therefore, in that which is good, compete for that which is good. So it's a very subtle way in this ayah that Allah is essentially saying, be part of this group. From amongst you, but honestly, who's going to want to be left out? Be part of that group that's going to call to good. So, when I'm watching this movie, I began to think of like all of these ayat, all of these ahadith, all of these things from the books of fiqh that really made, really made it apparent to me. So another one of the characteristics of this dream world is that it has multiple levels. And that this endeavor that we're talking about in terms of trying to be the manufacturers of a genuine American Muslim culture is going to have some layers to it. And that in the movie, the first, essentially the first part of the story of Inception, you can break up the movie really almost into 2 halves. In the first half of the movie, one is just sort of like laying out the story, you get to know the characters, and you get to know what they're doing. This is very important to us. We need to know what is our story and what it is that we're doing. And it's kind of a classic adventure story. It lays out the narrative, it presents the characters, and then the characters go through a bonding and a training process. They bond together, they're committed to a single goal, and then they begin to train for it. Right? They're not doing the real thing quite yet, but they practice and train for it. This is what we need right now. We need to bond together. I mean, this is one of the real, hikam of the Prophet ﷺ is that when the Muhajirun came to Medina to join the Ansar, he realized that he's like, I'm bringing one group of people from a different society and culture into another. When we go to Umrah and Hajj now, and we go to Saudi Arabia, and we travel between Mecca and Medina, does it look different? You don't have to think hard about it. Does it really look all that different? No. It looks all pretty much the same. Right? Or am I the only person that's made Hajj or Umrah? Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay. Good. All right. So I'm just saying, those of you who have been, Mecca and Medina pretty much look what? The same. If we go back to the prophetic period, those were two very different places. There were different cultures. They even spoke slightly different. They had different customs. Matter of fact, when the Muhajirun came to Medina, they got what? Sick. Because the environment was so different. Like right now, if I were to go, say, to East Africa and drink the water unfiltered, I would get sick because I don't have the same microbes and bacteria in my system that they have there that allow them to exist in that environment, right? They don't get sick drinking their water, but I might if I do because my system has not, acclimatized to that climate or to that location. So, sometimes you have to have, I would have to drink filtered water. So anyway, the first part of the movie is very, very important that it, one, lays out the primary goals and objectives of what they're going to try to do, and the main character, assembles a team, and they bond and they train. For us, this means that we, if we're going to have, we're not going to have one central leader, right? There's no Khalifa, so, but essentially this can be a stand-in for leadership. We need to have leadership. It's very, very important as we were talking, right? I mean, we're not a military, so we don't have this very structured hierarchy of leadership. But nonetheless, we got to have leadership that, if nothing else, inspires people to get on board. I mean, that's the thing that's really interesting about Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this movie that I found prophetic in a way of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is that he gets people on board for varying motivations. He gets people on board for varying motivations. And like I said, I really have a problem with the people that criticize Muslims that came to America from other countries for dunya reasons. That's not a blameworthy reason for coming here. It's okay to come here for a better life. It's okay to make money to support your family. Right? There's a difference between liking money and loving money. I don't know about you, I like money because I like to eat, I like to provide for my family, I like to be able to travel and do things like this, right? So liking money has never been an issue in Islam. That's why we do what with our wealth once a year? Well, not just do it, but what do we do to that money? Purify it. Right? In Islam, we purify wealth. We don't just, get rid of it or become poor. Right? We purify our wealth. So, matter of fact, if you don't have enough wealth, you don't meet the nasib, you don't do anything at all. If you pass that boundary, you purify whatever goes over that amount. Whether it's $10 over or $10,000 or $10 million, whatever. You purify it, and whatever is left over, if you're still wealthy, that means you're a person who's wealthy, whose money is what? Pure. So we don't have any bones. This all, money is the root of all evil, right? This is like a cultural saying we have in America. That is not correct. Money is not the root of all evil. As I said, evil is the root of all evil. So, part of it will also be our role is changing misconceptions of popular misconceptions of things that are in how they are. So he brings together people for various motivations. Some of them, like his friend in the movie Arthur, is just his friend. He's like, this is my boy, ride or die, Abu Bakr. Right? I'm with you to the end. Whatever you say, man, I'm here. And that we all know that there were other people that, as the Muslims began to gain more, political authority, and as they accomplished certain goals, like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, are most of you familiar with the Treaty of Hudaybiyah? One of the interesting things about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah is if you look at the number of converts to Islam before the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and the number of converts after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, they go what? Almost exponentially up. But why? Why is it, what is it that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah does that allows so many Arabs to become Muslims than before? It provided safety. It also, I mean, one of the things that they accomplished. Yeah, they had that. Yeah, but there were a lot of actually caveats in that treaty of which, well, you know, if anybody leaves Mecca and goes to Medina without permission, they have to get sent back and blah, 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 blah. One of the main things that they achieved, which was why the Prophet ﷺ wanted to make this treaty, and he accomplished one of the main goals, is that it gave them access to what? What did they want to do? They wanted to go for Umrah. Where do you make Umrah? In Mecca, but like primarily one of the major things is making tawaf around the Kaaba. What is the Kaaba? The Kaaba is just it's just a stone structure, but it does what? It symbolizes something. And in the Quran, well, at this time, it didn't quite yet symbolize Islam because it was controlled by who? The polytheists of Quraysh. And they were very prideful about being the custodians of the Kaaba because it represented something very sacred. And therefore, the only way to be seen as legitimate as a religious body in the Hijaz at this time was to have access to the Kaaba. By gaining access to the Kaaba, everybody else watching this whole game going on between Muhammad ﷺ and the Muslims and the Quraysh, everybody kind of watching this game from the sidelines, when they saw that touchdown, that the Muslims essentially made by getting access to the Kaaba, they jumped on the bandwagon. Right? We see this all the time. Like a team that's been bad for years, all of a sudden starts to win, what happens? People jump on the bandwagon. Why? People love a winner. Psychologically, people love a winner. So all these Arabs that have been watching the Prophet for all this time, they go, this La ilaha illallah thing, that seems pretty real. This Muhammad Rasulullah thing, maybe not, I don't know. Wow, man, did you see that touchdown, man? You see the way he caught that pass with one arm? Boom, they got the Kaaba. All of a sudden, everybody's like, Muhammad, rah, rah, sis, boom, bah. Right? I mean, it created a psychological space of where it's like, you know what? That's the team I'm going to get on now, man, because these guys seem like they're doing something. People love to ride the bandwagon, and that's not a bad thing. You know, sometimes, people who've been a diehard fan from the beginning, like, oh, you're just a band. Like, it's like Abu Bakr would be like, man, you haven't been here when we were starving in the desert? Like, yeah, I wasn't, but I love a winner. Just like myself, like, this past year, man, the Lions hadn't done anything, and I don't know when. And I haven't lived in Detroit for well over 10 years. Lions had a 6-3 record, man. I was going to work with a Lions jersey. People at work are like, I didn't even know you like sports. I like a winner. This opens up psychological spaces. So, Leonardo DiCaprio's character in the movie is able to get them on board because some of them are motivated by various reasons. Some of those, again, worldly reasons. Like one of the guy who is the chemist that is going to create these substances that allow them to go to sleep and to go into deeper layers. The reason why he agrees to partake is because Leonardo DiCaprio's character agrees to give him his entire share, right? They're being hired by this guy that's like a multimillionaire. He's all going to pay them some giant large sum of money. So they're all going to get a cut of the share. So he convinces this guy saying, hey man, if you work with me, I'll give you my entire share. So he was motivated by dunya reasons. But he was helping him accomplish a goal. This is very similar to when the Prophet and Abu Bakr ﷺ had to leave Mecca because of why? Well, they were, not just persecution, they were trying to kill the Prophet. The Quraysh finally said, enough is enough. We have to stamp out this Islam thing, and the only way is if we can cut off, we have to kill Muhammad ﷺ. We have to do this. So the Prophet's like, oh, I got to get out of here, man. We got to go. So he and Abu Bakr decide to leave, and they hire a man to take them through the back ways of the desert, who, according to majority of the sources in the Sirah, was a polytheist. The Prophet didn't say, find me a believer that knows the way through the desert. The Prophet's like, yo, these people want my head. I am bound and obligated by my Lord to deliver this message. We're not quite at the goal line yet, so I got to keep going. So whoever can get me there, I'm not going to get overly committed to labels. You're a mushrik, you're a polytheist, that's on you, man. I am Muhammad, you know my message, can you help me? I would encourage you to believe in this, but hey, ultimately, that's on you. He didn't get wrapped up in labels. And in the same way, illustrated through the movie, he's like, this guy's motivated by dunya reasons. Well, you know, sometimes that's a pretty honest motivation. So not being only defined by labels. And he hires people that have various skill sets because he himself doesn't have the capacity to do everything. This is like the Battle of Tabuk, of the trench, where the Prophet ﷺ uses the expert advice of who? Right. Like if there was an Islamic jeopardy, you would win. Right? So he relies upon the expert testimony and advice of Salman al-Farisi, who is, interestingly enough, what? Meaning he was not an Arab. So he's like a Persian amongst a whole bunch of Arabs. Right? And the Prophet, again, is who, ultimately? The ultimate authority in the religion. And yet he hires a non-Arab, a believer, but a non-Arab. Okay, you know, I need to win this battle. You got this great idea? Okay, let's go with it. He relies upon people that have expert skills to get the job done. This is very important in community building. We talk about manufacturing culture. Well, we need to be very critical in the hiring stage of who's going to work at this manufacturing plant. Right? We need to have quality control of who is going to be, you know, an expert in terms of, you know, we're going to need somebody to run this factory, somebody to work in this factory, somebody to manage this factory, right? So we need to have quality, you know, people who are professionals. So, you know, again, the character shows, and this is demonstrated obviously with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, to the willingness to rely upon other people who are experts in something that can help get the job done. So all these things are really critical in the first part. The second part of the movie is like where all the action takes place. And that's the fun part, you know, like the crazy fight scene and everything. I mean, those are all the fun things to watch. And that's where essentially everybody gets their chance to execute. And we need to get to that point. Because ultimately, as I said yesterday in the khutbah, Islam is a religion of action. So we need to do this first part of, you know, the theoretical stuff, the hiring, the getting the people, all these things. But ultimately, we don't want to just be satisfied with that. We want to get to the point that we begin to act. And again, what we act upon is just like, again, يَدَعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, calling to good. Right? Don't get over encumbered of trying to find some technical definition. We know what is good. So act upon what you know is good. And that's what you see in the movie. When the action starts, every single one of the characters just jumps into it and they do what they were hired to do. And they do what they're good at. They just go in and they do it. And there's a very funny scene where, you know, they're in this gunfight and these guys are trying to shoot them, and they're shooting back, and they're kind of like at a stalemate. And it's a dream world, right? So if you're in a dream world, you don't have to be bound only by, you know, our self-imposed conceptions of what is reality, right? It's a dream world, so you can kind of think up anything. So they're fighting with these guys, and they're at this stalemate. They just can't seem to win. So again, Tom Hardy's character, who's really funny, suddenly appears with like a rocket launcher, right? They're fighting with like rifles, and they're at a stalemate, and all of a sudden he comes in with this rocket launcher, and the other guy looks at him, and he's like, you mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger. And he shoots and blows it up, and it's hilarious. Right? I mean, make dua. Dua is what of the believer? They say it's the weapon of the believer. And I don't mean to be militaristic, but like, don't be afraid to make dua. We're about to set off on this great journey of trying to do all these things. It's going to take creativity. Don't be mentally trapped in the constructs that you impose upon yourself. Don't be afraid to dream a little bigger. We got about, what, 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I'll try, so I'll try to move some of this. So that's, again, that's why I really like this movie. It's very illustrative of these prophetic and Muslim and Quranic and Islamic qualities. It kind of brings them to life in a fun and entertaining way that's not lewd. So one of the troubles that they get into, and maybe I'll conclude with this, because this has all been the positive part, but again, we have to talk about managing culture so that things don't get out of control. So one of the problems that they run into in the movie is that they are in a dream world. And that sometimes, and we see this, people can lose the capacity to forget that this world is not permanent. If you begin to believe that this world is it, then that will begin to inform your character and your behavior. Right? I mean, honestly, if I feel like this life is it, then why would I care about whether I rape, pillage, rob, steal? Because I'm going to get mine and I'm gone, right? I mean, what's the whole purpose? So I might as well just go crazy and get all the money I can and just go nuts, because there's nothing else to live for. That's what happens when you forget that there are consequences beyond this temporary life. And that's one of the things that's beautiful about the movie, is it shows the potential danger of what happens when you begin to forget that this life isn't permanent. So that's why I really love the movie. There's so much, that I could go into, that I wish I could go into more. But I know it's after 1. You guys have been here for like 3 hours. It's pretty long. And I actually had like about 7 pages of notes, and I got to halfway down the first page. One other quick aspect about the dream world, right? One quick aspect about this life, because it isn't permanent, it is inherently unstable. Right? So as in the movie, one of the interesting things about Inception is that as they become more aware of the fact that this world, this dream world isn't the real thing, it becomes unstable, right? So it's funny, like when they're dreaming and they're in a car and the car begins to swerve, things actually kind of also swerve in the dream world. So this life, a lot of times we're always looking for stability. But we're looking for stability in the wrong place. Stability that we will have in this life will not be making this life more stable and permanent, because it is inherently impermanent. Stability will come through yaqeen and tawakkul. Stability in this life will come through being, having security and sincerity towards belief in God and relying upon God. That's where security will come. It will not come in being able to control the instabilities of the world. That's above our pay grade. That's not possible. So therefore, we should direct our energies not trying to make something that is inherently unstable stable. We should direct our energies towards that which does provide stability, which is belief in God. And therefore, we should obviously strengthen this amongst ourselves, and then try to work with those around us to invite them, وَلْتَكُنْ أُمَّةٌ مِّنْكُمْ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمَرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَلَى الْمُنكَرِ. That is what will make our lives stable in this life. Literally is God. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what will provide the stability in our lives. And the surefire method of attaining that stability is through the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. That is how you achieve it. So I wish I had, so much more time. I mean, a lot of it was just going into, greater and greater and greater detail about things. Perhaps if you want to have a Q&A after, I can maybe, go into a few extra details or answer questions and share a few more anecdotes from it. But Jazakum Allahu khairan. I really appreciate it. Inshallah, I guess we're going to break for Salah. So we'll end with the dua. ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وارحمنا وعافنا واعف عنا إنك أنت الغفور الرحيم. ربي اغفر لنا ولوالدينا ولمن دخل بيوتنا وللمؤمنين وللمؤمنات ولا تزد الظالمين إلا ضلالا. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. وصلواتك وسلامك على نبيك الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.